You're listening to Laura McGhie on BBC Radio 5 Live. Now, Christmas can be one of the most expensive periods of the year for families. The food, the presents, it all adds up really, really quickly, doesn't it? And we know that we're in a cost of living crisis. Between April and August 2022, over half of food banks surveyed by the Independent Food Aid Network, which represents 550 independent food banks, well, they found that 25% or more of the people they supported hadn't used their services before. Now, Lily Joe is a children's mental health expert and the author of Talking to Children About Mental Health.
So I guess, in terms of now where we stand, we know with the cost of living crisis and research done by the charity Young Minds that the cost of living crisis in particular is impacting young people today. So the cost of living was the major worry for over half of young people, and they reported disruption to daily life, particularly with their diet and sleep. And we know that it's also affecting younger children. So 21% of 11-year-olds said money worries was causing them stress, anxiety, unhappiness, or anger. So we definitely know that at the moment, children are worried about what's going on in the world, in particular, the cost of living crisis.
Yeah. So you're saying 11-year-olds are conscious about money. Now, obviously, not many 11-year-olds have a lot of money. They are getting money from their parents. So is this a direct sort of hand down of mood, of feeling, of atmosphere from parents and from carers?
Yeah, so I think it's easy to underestimate how much children kind of pick up on our mood as parents and caregivers. And just like for adults, children can experience things like anxiety, sleep problems, feelings of fear, shame, or feelings of embarrassment that they might not particularly be getting the same amount of presents as other children this Christmas in particular. So it's really important that we do recognise and acknowledge and try and kind of understand where our children are coming from, and also, be there to support them in this particular time and climate that we're in right now.
Yeah, and that comparing yourself to other kids. How much of that comes down to the fact that we live in very much a social media climate right now, where kids have access to seeing what other children are getting and what other children are doing pretty much 24/7?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it plays a huge part. When I was growing up in particular, I only knew what my neighbours on the street were getting for Christmas or what some of my friends perhaps from school were getting. But now children have their devices in the palm of their hands where they can see what children in other countries are getting or what celebrity children are getting. So it's a very different comparison than what it used to be. And I think that provides a huge amount of stress and pressure on our children and on our young people today.
People may be tempted to then put on a brave face for the family. So on Christmas morning, act like everything's absolutely fine, that the presents are great, and maybe go over and above, exaggerate how great everything is. But kids, they're a bit wiser than that, aren't they? They can sense that something is not quite right. So is there much point in putting on that brave face for children and for kids?
I think it's really important that we make sure that the lines of communication are open between us and our children. And everybody's in a different situation, so we can't actually give advice on one particular thing to say or do. You have to know what's right and best for your child. So I know in particular for my children, it's really important that I am open and honest, and that I do that age appropriate. So I have a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old, so they can both understand different levels of communication. But I think it's important that we understand that children, as I said at the beginning of the interview, they know more than we think. And so we have to treat them with respect, actually, and actually give them more credit than I perhaps in my generation growing up, it was children must be seen and not heard. So, but now actually, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that children understand far more than we think. And we actually acknowledge the way they are feeling and talk about that and have that open dialogue and conversation with them. And as I said, that is age appropriate for them.
And how honest do you think people should be? Because obviously you can go into a room with your child and explain every minute detail about how worried you are about things, and that might not help as well. So in your experience, how much information should you pass on to your child about your worries?
Yeah, I think it is age appropriate and it is what they can handle. And, I know one of my children is much more anxious than the other. So, I would be trying to shelter and protect that one more than the other one, if that makes sense. And as I said, I think it is child dependent. But I think it's important that we are, as caregivers and parents, maybe compartmentalizing our worries where possible. So, for example, making sure that we are doing all the worrying in one moment where possible. So, for example, when the child is at nursery or the child is at school or the child is at uni or asleep in bed, that's when we can maybe process, okay, what is it that's worrying us? How can we get that out, maybe perhaps onto a page and write down some of those things, and then maybe cross out the things that we just can't control, but write down as many solutions as possible to the things that we can control. And it's interesting when you spend 10 to 20 minutes with a piece of paper and a pen, what you can actually come up with. And half the things that we worry about never even come to pass. So it's about making sure that we compartmentalize those worries, process them as much as possible. And then I guess whatever is left over that's important to share with our children, that's what we can share. So, for example, if Christmas is going to be a bit smaller this year, then having that conversation and saying, hey, kids, Christmas is going to be a bit different this year. We're going to do one present each, but we're also going to do this, this, and this. And we know, don't we, from lockdown, that there are lots of things we can actually do for free. There are lots of things that don't involve lots of money. And there's lots of things that we can do creatively. So it's about really thinking, what is possible? What is the solution for our family this Christmas? What can we do perhaps differently? And having that open dialogue, that open line of communication so that everyone understands, okay, we're going to do this, and being as optimistic as possible about it, making sure that there's a lot of joy around that, which can be difficult. But I think if we're practicing gratitude and maybe we're saying, well, what are we grateful for this Christmas? Then that can also really help our well-being.
And what role do you think other members of the family play in this, Lily Jo? So I'm thinking that a lot of our listeners will be perhaps going to see their grandchildren maybe this Christmas. Should they be getting in on this idea of being honest to an extent and sitting down the kids and not playing along with this idea that it's happy families or anything like that, but being honest and, being just aware that the child perhaps knows that something is different this Christmas than it has been other Christmases?
Yeah, if grandparents and other caregivers and other family members feel that it's appropriate to have a conversation about that, then, fair enough. I feel like that's, again, their prerogative. But I think, there's a level of optimism, isn't there, that we can practice that isn't toxic, but that's real. And it's like, actually, you could be honest and say something like, I know that this Christmas isn't the exact same as what we used to, but look, aren't we grateful that we have each other? And go around the dinner table and say one thing that you're grateful for. Could be just one exercise in being honest and acknowledging the situation, but also being positive around the situation.
How much do we know, Lily Jo, about children talking to other children about what's worrying them at home during this cost of living crisis? Do other kids speak to their friends about it, or do they tend to keep it to themselves?
Yeah, I don't actually know the answer to that. I think, again, it depends on the child and how much they can articulate how they're feeling. And I know, for example, my 10-year-old, they watch news round at school. So they have conversations about what's happening in the world, but that feels age appropriate to them. And I often talk to them and say, look, what did you watch on Newsround today? Just so that I can get a gauge of what they already know about the world. So I think that can be a good thing as well, is perhaps if you want to, watch the news yourself, watch Newsround yourself first, see what's been, fed to the child that day, and then have a conversation about that. Well, what do you think about this, and this, X, Y, and Z? And what do your friends think about that? I guess it's about asking the question, do you talk to each other about this stuff? Is this stuff that you're interested in? And again, it's down to that open and honest line of communication that, again, is age appropriate to your child. Obviously, the listeners tonight might have 3-year-old grandchildren or 10-year-old nieces and nephews. So it is definitely about maybe just being curious and asking those questions. And they might be like, don't know anything about the cost of living crisis. Yeah. Or they might be like, oh my goodness, yes, it's been really worrying me. That's something that I'm very scared about. What if we lose our home? What if we don't have heating? And that's when you can start to address some of those fears then. But until we ask the questions, then we're never going to know. So I think it's really important that as adults, we compartmentalize our worries so that we can be present for the child and ask those curious questions.